Hello, I just want to make this short video to show what I've managed to do with this Toyota KS787 that wasn't working at all. It's a marvellous machine. It has two options. You can use it manually with 12 buttons to select across 12 needles, or the machine is equipped with a card reader and it can read cards and the motifs from the cards. But the machine was damaged in the post. I think it suffered from a knock when it came from England to France. And I decided I wanted to open the machine and take a look inside, try and understand how it worked and see whether I could fix up the problem. And I seem to have managed to do that. And the problem came from the card reader, and it's a problem that anyone could possibly have. And so I'll explain what I did and how that bit works, and how I took the casing off the machine and put it back together again, because I've done some research on the internet and I haven't really found much about this particular model. There's a nice clip by Charlie on the Vintage Knitting Machine Company that shows the machine open and shows how the needle selection system works, but I didn't find any specific help on my particular problem, but I've managed to solve that. And so first of all, how to get into the machine. The machine has a top case on the left hand end that protects the card reader and the card reader button, and has the row counter mounted on it, and that's very easy to remove. There is just one screw on this part, and no need to remove the card advance knob, but you will have to remove the clutch knob. It just pulls off in order for you to slip the casing off. The row counter is an integral part of the casing. You don't need to remove that. You just remove that part of the casing. The second part of housing, large plastic housing that protects the buttons and has the tool holder, is held in place with a selection of, I think, 5 screws, one in the bottom of the right hand tool holder, one in front of where the needle section selector button is, called the automotive button. You need to remove the automotive button. There's a tiny screw behind it. Unscrew that, pull the button off, make sure you noted down in what position the button was when you pulled it off. Remove that screw, a screw in front of the zigzag button, which you had to remove as well, and then 2 screws at the end of the casing, and then you can gently lift that off, and then you can remove the end pieces. The end pieces have 2 screws that go into the bed plate, these 2 screws here, and then 1 screw in the back of the machine and 2 screws in the base. 1 screw in the back of the plate and the 2 that you can see in the bottom. And that's the same for the right hand end and the left hand end pieces of the machine. Once you remove the 2 top parts and the 2 end parts of the machine, you have 1 more piece to remove in order to have access to the kind of guts of the machine, and that is this mustard coloured metal bar, which is purely part of the casing. It's there for aesthetic reasons. I haven't cleaned the machine yet. I've disassembled it and repaired the problem, but all of this will be cleaned up before I put it back together. And in order to remove this plate, you need to move by hand the needle reading bar, and that's this bar here. And when you are using the carriage and you have the carriage set in pattern mode because you want to read a card, you put the feeder button forward. That brings out this little metal tongue, and this tongue is what catches on this needle reader bar. When the carriage passes by, it pushes it forward, and that's what's going to select your needle. And you can probably see as I push that, and it advances a card every row, whether it goes from left to right, or the carriage goes back from right to left. and this mustard coloured bar sits underneath the card reading bar, and so in order to unscrew it you need to push the bar forward, and you can see that reveals this little tab here where there is a screw, and you have one just to the right of the card reader and a second one just to the right of the selector buttons there. That's there. And so just two screws to remove, and that reveals the inner workings of the machine. And the problem that I had was underneath the card reader, and I will do my best to show this to you, perhaps with a torch. This is the end of the needles. If I push them forward, you can see that's the end of the needles. Behind the card reader bar, what looks like the end of the needles is in fact the end of what I've been referring to as pistons, and these are L-shaped. And what you can see at the moment, if I turn my torch on and try and illuminate them, what you can see down there is the horizontal part of these pistons. They are L-shaped, flat, horizontal and L-shaped, and the vertical part of those pistons runs up into the bottom of each slit on the card reader. Underneath them there is a spring that keeps them pushed upwards, so as the card goes by, every time there's a hole, the piston pops up into the slit. And that's why the clutch button is all important. If you want to advance the card, or you want to select needles manually using a button, you need to make sure that the pistons are not in the card reader. So you press the clutch button, and I don't know if that's visible there, you'll see it pushes all the pistons down. I think that will be clearer if I show that from the end. And so if I come to the end of the machine and you look at the pistons, I'm zooming in there, and I press the clutch, you'll see a clutch plate comes down. There it is, that's the clutch plate moving, goes down, and it will push all 24 of those pistons down. And when I release the clutch plate, the plate is brought up by its own spring that you can see in the foreground on the right, but the needles are brought up by an individual spring. There is one spring under each needle at a sort of 45-degree angle there. And what has happened to my machine is that the springs had just popped beside each of the pistons, and so they weren't working, or they were working randomly. And I think there are two reasons that could cause this issue. One is an impact, and I think my machine had been bashed about by the post office. But also, if you press a needle selector button without pressing the clutch, rather than anything breaking, the piston will just slip down beside its spring. And if you try and advance the in card, again, without putting on the clutch, the same thing will happen. And so when you use the selector button, when you put in the card, or when you use the zigzag button or the needle section selector button, the automotive button, always press the clutch bar. And so I just took a longish screwdriver, fiddle about down there, and managed to get the springs back under each of the pistons. And so now my needle selection is working absolutely perfectly, and I can select needles manually on the machine, or I can select them using the card reader. And this will be difficult to illustrate because holding the phone and pressing the clutch and selecting buttons is not easy, but I'm going to try and zoom in on those pistons down in the front of the card reader. Those are the pistons there. I'm going to press the clutch forward if I can, and if I press the buttons there, 1, 3, 5, 7, 9 and 11, and now let's let the clutch go, you can see that those pistons have been selected alternately. They match exactly the position of the buttons, and so 12 buttons, but 24 pistons, 24 slots on the card, so it's a motif that is repeated. And if I go to my auto knit button, I've selected number 2, so the section of needles, the 20s, out of the selection are the ones that will be in work. And if I take my newly mended carriage and slip it on the machine, okay, the carriage is in place, and obviously I select the pattern buttons and deselect the card feeder because I'm reading the buttons and not the card. And if I move my carriage along, all quiet, till I get to the 20s, and there you can see it has done a beautiful job of selecting the needles that I've asked it to select, and so everything is working beautifully. And if I return the carriage to plain and slide back, then it will put all the needles back where they are supposed to be. So the card reader is working and the buttons are working. I've been able to remove and put back in the sponge bar. Having repaired the whole thing and got the whole thing working, I'm delighted. I found there was one needle, the 6th needle from the right hand end, that wasn't working. Very strange. And then in close inspection I could see it was just about the tail end of that needle was sticking up about 1 millimetre compared to the others. And so I removed the sponge bar, removed the needle, and just bent it. It was slightly banana shaped. I just gently bent it back straight, put it back in, and it's behaving itself perfectly like the rest of the needles. So next job now is to clean all the individual bits and pieces and get the whole machine back together, and sit down with the manual and learn how to do some decent knitting. And thanks everyone on the Facebook group for all the help that you've given me to get this far, and I hope that this might be useful for anyone else having the same machine or the same issue on another machine. As I say, I know nothing about knitting machines. I don't know whether this system is unique to the Toyota or whether other machines have a similar system, but if you have a similar problem, it's probably worth taking a look at that. All the best. Bye-bye.